today, I think, a schedule of examinations, in which 250 SS 251, huh? Wait a minute, I'm just getting to that. Let me. The schedule of final examination in which we are located, ignore it. I mean, you might, if you want to show up for the hell of it, you can do it. I'm not going to be there. The final will be next Monday at the same time, same spot as Thursday. In other words, let me see. Wait a minute. In other words, we have a class. Yeah, we have a class now, right? Now we also have a class on Thursday at room 503. On Monday, next Monday will be Thursday. In other words, Monday has been designated in the wisdom of Brooklyn Poly as Thursday. So we show up, we act as if it's Thursday on Monday, and it's going to be the final. In other words, it's going to be a 2-hour class in room 503, keeping our fingers crossed everything works out. At the room, huh? Yes, in other words, from 2 to 4 on room 503. Monday, what's the date? Anyway, next Monday. Huh? 3rd. Monday, May 3rd, yeah. 2 to 4 p.m. Room 503. Well, we're still in the labor market. We finished the union question and now dealing with population. In other words, one of the things, of course, that determines the labor supply, or the stock of labor, is how many people there are. Quiet place. There's been a lot of nonsense spoken about populations. I think I mentioned last time, I'll just review it. In the old days, that means the history of Western civilization, let's say, it was considered the more people, the better. In other words, higher population was considered a test of whether the society is doing well. So the idea was to have increased population. Also, of course, the ruling classes of the time, the feudal lords and the privileged merchants and the kings, etc., wanted more people. They have more cannon fodder, more people to march against Burgundy or whoever the enemy is around the hill. So the higher population means a bigger army. Then, as I think I mentioned, in the early 19th century, late 18th, actually 1798 to 1820 period, the Reverend Thomas Robert Malthus, famous English Anglican churchman and economist, wrote his famous essay on population, giving rise to the theory called Malthusianism, essay on population. And here he wrote this in a period when England had embarked on its industrial revolution. The standard industry was increasing tremendously, and standard of living was going up a lot, and the population was going up a lot. In other words, to oversimplify a lot, the population of Europe remained about the same from, say, 1000 AD to about 1750, with certain fluctuation, but basically remain about constant. See, we're used now to a situation where the population grows every year. It didn't do that in the old days. Okay? So then after when the Industrial Revolution comes in about 1750, population of England started doubling after every 30 years or whatever. In other words, it started going up a lot, doubling in 50 years, whatever it was. And so Malthus is writing around here, observing a situation where the standard of living was going up and the population was going up, and he's very gloomy. Everything is going to hell because population is pressing on the food supply. And he's writing this in a period, one of the few periods when population wasn't pressing on the food supply, and he's gloom and doom itself, gloom and doom personified. So what he said was that the population tends to grow geometrically. What he meant by that is that every 2 people have 4 kids, and then this person has 4 kids, whatever. So it sort of grows exponentially or whatever over years. You have a tremendous increase in population, something like fruit flies. Give fruit flies their head, and they quadruple every couple of hours or whatever. It's not done at that rate. But the idea is that people are sort of like animals or like fruit flies or whatever. They keep multiplying all the time. On the other hand, the food supply increases arithmetically. In other words, it only goes up a certain amount each year. So, as a result of that, the population tends to press, in the famous phrase of Malthus, tends to press on the food supply, on the means of subsistence, being the food supply. So, population is always pressing on the means of subsistence, and this causes the wage rate always to be around subsistence level. In other words, just about enough to keep people keep people functioning and reproducing. That's about it. So in other words, the standard of living can never go up for any length of time because people breed faster, and and it presses the population right down again. So you have, in other words, that this is the supply. This is wage rates in real terms now. Real wage rates, meaning correctly for inflation or in price level changes. If demand for labor goes up a little bit, let's say, and wage rates go up, very soon population will breed up until you're down again to the subsistence level. Ricardo then adopts this. Smith really adopts it more or less. Ricardo adopts it, and this gets into classical economics. And Karl Marx adopted it. See, what you have is basically the so-called iron law of wages, where wages are always pressing on the means of subsistence. People are always on the brink of starvation. In other words, because if they get a little bit more affluent, they breed more kids right away. And you're back down at the semi-starvation level. Population is then kept in check by various what Malthus calls checks. In other words, people are breeding like rabbits, and the population is kept down by famine, okay, by disease, which is quite similar, and by war, where people are quarreling over the last piece of bread left or whatever. So war, famine, and disease then keep down the population. Keep the population level from going over the edge. Actually, it goes over the edge and comes back again, so to speak. So this is a gloomy view of life in general, of course, and Malthus's only remedy for all this was what was known euphemistically as late marriages. In other words, abstinence and late marriages, so that you keep down the population level. As one might expect, there wasn't any mass adoption of this doctrine, in practice at least. So people might be Malthusian in theory, but in practice they didn't really follow this. The neo-Malthusians, who have more or less the same view as Malthus, except don't have his religious outlook, are of course in favor of birth control as a method rather than abstinence. Method of keeping down the population. But the focus is more or less the same without the arithmetic geometric stuff. Basically, the idea being that the population keeps breeding, multiplying, etc., and you have to have voluntary restraint of some sort, or even compulsory restraint, to keep down the population. Oddly enough, by around the 1920s and 1930s, population growth was going down. As a matter of fact, to the extent that population in France, I think, was actually going down over the years. At this point, the population in Europe was leveling off and even going down after a couple hundred years or 150. Yeah.
Isn't that during World War?
Yeah, that certainly that helped. World War I helped to reduce. Yes, it helped to decrease the population a lot. No question about it. Actually, in the Christmas Carol, Charles Dickens' Scrooge, you ever watched that on television or read it? Scrooge is the epitome of the Malthusian classical economist and work. And anytime they ask Scrooge to give $1 to the poor or something, no, he says we have to reduce the surplus population. And if you help anybody out, it means you're delaying this beneficent process, reducing surplus population. So the idea of the surplus population comes from Malthusian doctrine. So this has been you're right. World War I certainly helped quote unquote help to reduce the population. And then by 1930s, Western European governments began to give subsidies to get people to breed more kids because they were worried about cannon fodder again. How will France or Germany or whatever have enough people go into the army to fight? So they started having subsidy bounties per kid. After World War II, there was a big increase in the number of kids. It was really, in the United States, it was sociological. The veterans came back and they started, and the shift away from women working. There was a big increase in women working in the 20s and 30s. After World War II, there was a shift back to the home and family, etc. The so-called baby boom came into operation. And a lot more kids were born in the 50s and 60s. Big families became popular again, etc. By the 1970s, the late 60s, early 70s, the ZPG movement comes in. A bunch of neo-Malthusian hysterics who call for zero population growth. And usually their forecasts are very similar to the guys who say that we're running out of oil in 10 years. It's very similar. They took the population growth, say, for the rate of population growth in the 1960s. They extrapolated for 100 years as if it's going to continue at the same rate. They came to the conclusion in 50 years we won't have any room to walk. It'd be, two quadrillion people, we couldn't move. That was basically the argument. And using computers, etc., doesn't reduce the naivete of this approach. And they started calling for zero population growth, for advanced birth control techniques, etc., etc. Economists are some economists are on the forefront of this. It's typical that only economists came up. Distinguished economist Professor Boulding of the University of Colorado came up. He was a big ZPG person. He wanted to introduce a market approach too. He didn't see the true ZPGers, the militant ZPGers, in favor of compulsory birth control. In other words, allowing every woman can only have 2 kids. Have a third kid, you shoot the kid, or whatever the approach is. Okay, these are the extremists. This has been done in I believe in some extent in China, at least under Mao. The compulsory sterilization and compulsory infanticide, and called late abortion, I guess you can call it. At any rate, the Boulding, being a sort of free market economist, comes up with a market approach to two people for every woman, 2 kids for every woman. His approach is this: we shouldn't say every woman should have only 2 kids. That's sort of tyrannical, sort of despotic, sort of totalitarian. What we should do is this: every woman is conferred the right at the age, whatever age of 10 or something, you give each female the right to have 2 kids. This right, however, is negotiable on the market. So that if you want to have 3 kids, you have to buy the right from some woman that doesn't want 2 kids, wants to have 1 or 0 kids. Okay? So you have a free market, quote-unquote free market, and baby rights. And this way you pay and you get a market price. The baby right is then determined by supply and demand, like taxi medallions are. We'll get into that today or Thursday. Is determined then by supply and demand. Only an economist could come up with this nonsense. And it's true that it'd be better from a libertarian perspective to have a free market and baby rights to have two kids for every female. It's still totalitarian, however. It's only the icing on the cake. At any rate, the ZPG hysteria reached its maximum around I would say the early 1970s, just at the point when population growth began to decline. In other words, this is typical of what happens in social trends. Hysteria about a certain problem usually reaches its maximum just after the problem is being eliminated. So when the 1970 census came out, it takes about 2 or 3 years to process the census, they discovered, by God, and lo and behold, population growth really declined severely during the 1960s and reached a point where ZPG will arrive in, 20, 30 years or whatever. As a result of this discovery, the ZPG hysteria has more or less died out in the last 10 years. It might always come back again. These things happen in fashions. So it's something like hemlines or whatever. Every 10 years is a different shtick here. But at any rate, and they're now getting to the point, now that we have more or less, we're getting to the point of ZPG. We're getting to the point of declining population growth. These same people were complaining about the no standing room, you have to have compulsory birth control or whatever. And I was saying, Jesus, there's a lot of problems with slower population growth. It means the population gets older every year, and indeed it does. In other words, if you cut down the rate of population growth, this is the so-called population pyramid. You have, if this is the number of people from 0 to 10 and 10 to 20, and it's 60 to 80 or something, and the width is the number of people. This is the age bracket. If you cut down, if you have a high population growth, it means you have a big base of the pyramid and a small top. If you cut down population growth, of course, the average age is going to get older, obviously. So all of a sudden, these same jerks are now saying, "Geez, it means the average age is getting older. It means we have more old people to support. How are we going to support? Because we have to shoot the old people now. Before we shot the kids, now we have to shoot the old people." That's the latest problem on the horizon. At any rate, and also the mayors of different cities kept saying, "No, there must be more people." In other words, they had a census every 10 years. There's a census. The census says 3.2 million people in a certain city. The mayor says, no, it's got to be 3.8 million because they get federal aid per person. So every mayor of every city is constantly beating the bushes, calling for a recount, demanding more people. And these same people 10 years ago were calling for compulsory birth control, more or less, or something like it. At any rate, major point here is the whole population problem is overblown. It's not really much of a problem, and let's see why. One of the best ways to look at it is a concept called the optimum population point. The word optimum is a bad one. It implies that it's somehow the best population, but it's not supposed to mean that. But anyway, it's a useful way of looking at it. If you have a diagram on the y-axis is standard of living or output per person, or with productivity or output of goods and goods per person. Now, obviously, you can't really measure it, but in some vague way, you can understand it can be more or less. If output per person is on the y-axis, and number of people is on the x-axis. And again, if you got no people, if the whole world was wiped out by, let's say I had a neutron bomb, a giant neutron bomb wiped out. Neutron bomb, of course, is one which is beloved by most establishment think tank types. It kills only people. It doesn't destroy any property. It only kills people. It makes it good. I could never figure out why exactly. But anyway, at any rate, if you have no people, if the whole world were wiped out by one giant plague, there'd still be the factories and the land and the natural resources. There won't be no people, therefore there'll be no production. So again, you start at the point of origin. Okay? 0 people, 0 production. At any given time, in other words, given the capital investment and given the technological knowledge at any given moment, you have something like this. As you add one more person, you get some production, etc. So you get to the point, an output per person, where it reaches a peak as you get more and more people, and finally turns downward. This is, in a sense, average productivity. Remember, the average physical productivity. Overall average physical productivity can never get negative. You can't have minus production. But if you keep adding people with a fixed amount of capital goods and resources, land, and technological knowledge, will start turning down. So this is essentially of the average productivity curves. Okay. And we can say then that for any given level of capital and technological knowledge, those number of people which yield the maximum average productivity is the so-called optimum population point. Let's say for a certain country or a certain time, it's 2 million. This is 2 million. This is the quote optimum population. So that below that you have a lower productivity per person, and above that you have a lower productivity per person. So what we're saying is that at some point there's some kind of maximum. Okay. Now nobody knows what the maximum is. There's no way at any given time or any given country to figure it out. There's no test. But you can sort of vaguely say, all right, this is more or less the situation, but somewhere around there, probably. And if you look at it this way, if for example, tomorrow half the people in the country died of a plague, okay, and so there only be half the people left, productivity per person will go way down because there wouldn't be enough people to man the various machines and all the rest of it. And so the productivity per person will go down. On the other hand, if you had a magic cloning system like in the science fiction pictures where everybody was automatically instantaneously cloned, you'd have twice as many people, and obviously they had nothing to do. There'd be no way that they could fit into the current system, and the productivity per person will go down too. So in other words, we're somewhere in here. Nobody knows exactly where we are at any given time. It's somewhere around near the peak or something. So that you can then say this is not a moral optimum. It doesn't say this is the best population point, but it does say this: if people are then confronted with some kind of a choice, namely to have more kids at a cost of a slightly lower living standard for the family. So in other words, and they can choose having more kids. You can choose having 8 kids, knowing that your income per kid will be going down. And so you're choosing to be a little bit further to the right. In other words, you're trading off between living standard for the family and having more kids. After all, having kids is presumably a positive benefit for the family. Otherwise, they presumably wouldn't have them. So in other words, they're trading off a psychic benefit of having a kid as against the possible psychic cost of a drop in the average living standard. And each family will make its own decision on that basis. So that's, I think, a much better way of looking at it. In other words, population usually fits into what's economically desirable at the time. And at any given point, they can trade off, every person or individual or family can trade off living standard and number of people. Another thing also very important to look at is over time, productivity keeps going up. As I said, with capital, as real wage rates go up and employment goes up over time, as capital keeps increasing and gets better, So what you have over time is this sort of stuff. It's a family of curves which over time keeps increasing so that the productivity keeps going up, and the optimum population point keeps increasing. So it goes up from here to there, et cetera, et cetera. So over the decades and the centuries, the optimum population point keeps going up. So instead of more people being a threat, more people is a good thing, even economically, because you're able to provide more division of labor. If you only have one person, if there's only one person left in the country, you have a neutron, a plague, one person is left, you wouldn't be able to produce much of anything, even with all this massive equipment. So that this optimum population point keeps going up over time. When Columbus discovered America, there were nobody knows exactly how many Indians there were here. There was somewhere, say a few million, say 5 million, something like that. The Indians are mostly living on a subsistence level. They indeed were living on a subsistence level because they're more or less adapted. The population more or less adapts to the available resources. So you had 5 million Indians living at subsistence level. We now have, this is all of North America, by the way, South, Central, and Canada and the United States, about 5 million. Now we have in this whole area about 200 million, something like that. Almost each of which is living an infinitely higher living standard than the 5 million over here when the Europeans got here. So in other words, what you have then is over time an enormous increase in population, each one at a much higher living standard. In other words, the optimum population point keeps shifting upward and to the right as you have more and more capital equipment and better technology and all the rest of it. So population, in other words, is not really an active force. It usually adapts over time to the available living standard, available resources. It's very much like energy things adapt. Oil does not become short because you find more oil, you get other energy sources. It's something similar in population. But usually, what's happened in population growth in the underdeveloped countries, or developing countries, whatever you want to call them, third world countries, there's been a fashion in this too. In the time I've been teaching economics, third world countries were originally called backward countries. This was considered discriminatory or nasty. The word backward was then outlawed, and then they were called undeveloped countries. This also was considered nasty, and then it was called developing countries, which gets very peculiar because we're all developing. You don't have to be. It's very odd. So now it's called third world. I guess it's as good as anything else. Anyway, third world countries. What happened there was usually again the population level was about the same. In other words, birth rates and death rates. This is what happened in England before 1750. In a sense, they were pressing on means of subsistence, except they weren't. Everybody's not at starvation level. It was a much higher level. At any rate, in a sense, birth rates and death rates were about the same, and population more or less remained about the same. And then what happened was, in England in the 18th century, what happened was a big drop in the death rate due to better food. In other words, they're eating better, nutrition was better, and therefore disease was kept under control. Disease was much less. Disease is largely caused, by the way, by bad food. In other words, inadequate nutrition, one way or the other. And so, as nutrition got better, the disease rates and death rates in Britain went way down. The same thing happened in third world countries in the 1940s and 50s. As Western medicine spread to the third world countries, death rates fell very sharply. So what you have is, here's birth rate. Population, of course, is determined by birth rate and death rate. But to make it very simple, birth rate minus the death rate. In other words, the birth rate per 1,000 is 5, and the death rate per 1,000 is 4. You can have an increase in population of 1 per 1,000. So the death rate suddenly fell. Okay, and it was very sharply, more so in the third world in the 1940s. You have a very dramatic drop in death rates. And the birth rate continues on for a while. So what you have during this period is a tremendous increase in population. And there are studies in Barbados and West Indies, Barbados and Jamaica, etc., where you can see that happening as the death rate falls in the 40s and 50s and birth rate remains the same. Big population increase. And most people think that all of a sudden people breed faster. There's a tremendous increase in births. That's not the way it works. The birth rate remains about the same, just as the death rate falls, and so population goes up. And then what happens after 20, 30, 40 years, after a transition period, people get used to want a higher living standard, the birth rate usually falls proportionately, so you wind up somewhere like here, back to an equilibrium level, so to speak, with people then voluntarily cutting their births in order to enjoy a higher living standard for the family. And this is what happened in England in the 19th century, and what's happening now in third world countries. It's already beginning to happen. This process. It takes a little while, but the thing is, you can't just extrapolate population growth rates for hundreds of years. There's adaptation taking place all the time, and this is one of them. So it's happening now in the United States after hysteria was taking over. By the 1960s, birth rates started to fall. As I say, now they're beginning to bellyache about an older population. So as a result, this is one of the. Anyway, there's no way of getting around this. If you cut the population growth, birth rates. Older average age of the population is going up. So, at any rate, this is the. Therefore, usually the situation is there's no real long range worry about population. Population usually adapts to the resources and standard of living available, and this I hope has learned to quiet. And as I say, the population hysteria is really damped down for a while, but it can always pop up again. And yeah.
What's the purpose of policy of China limiting these governments over power?
Well, they took over unfortunately the Western Malthusian view, the population growth. The evil in say China and India with overpopulation. It's not really overpopulation, but I think they're now wising up to that. I think that there's a trend away from this at this point. I think in Japan there is. So because the problem is not really population, the problem is really, in other words, if you take let's take another thing. If you take, I think they were sucked into it by Western Malthusian demographers. Oh, sure, yeah. But I mean, the thing is that part of the living standard is for people who want to have kids, part of their living standard is having kids. In other words, standard of living is a psychic question, not just strictly a material one. In other words, you're trying to fulfill various goals and objectives. If one of your goals is to have several kids, that's part of your living standard. So you can't have an outside person arbitrarily say, we want to increase your living standard by forcing you not to have kids. To them, that's a real cut in psychic income. I mean, after all, the objective is psychic income. In other words, to fulfill whatever your objectives happen to be or your goals happen to be. So the question is, can an outside group set your goals for you or know what your goals are, or whatever? I strongly doubt it. Another thing, if you look at population density, another way of looking at it is this. There's no correlation between population density, which the objective method is number of people per square mile, and standard of living. So in other words, if you were right, or if the Malthusians were right, it should be a higher the density, it should be a lower standard of living. And you take it doesn't work that way at all. In some cases, almost the opposite. For example, in the Western world, the highest density population is probably Holland. Certainly Western Europe. Holland has a high standard of living and a high density. Okay. Holland has probably the highest density, has one of the highest standards of living in Europe. West Germany is a high density population. United States has a much lower density population than West Europe. On the other hand, has a higher density population than a lot of other countries. It's somewhere in the middle of density. Switzerland has a high density population, has a very high standard of living. As a matter of fact, you can tell the difference if you ever visit both the Alps and the Rockies. It's very instructive. If you look at population density, the Alps, magnificently high. I like high density, at least up to a certain point, but personally. And, if you live in Manhattan, you have to like high density anyway. In Switzerland, you go in the Alps, every Alp is tilled, cultivated, there's a cabin everywhere, the cows are up the slopes. It's great. You go to the Rockies, there's no people. Not only no people, if you drive across the country when you get to Nebraska, from Nebraska until the border of California, it's like 2,000 miles, it's zipped. There's nothing there. No people, no houses, no trees, no nothing. And I also want to suggests that for the ZPG people worried about high population growth in the United States, all you have to do is to parachute them in Arizona and Wyoming, let them fend for themselves for a while. There's nothing out there. Zip! Even in California, except for selected sectors, it's very low density population. And again, you have in Asia, probably the highest density is in Hong Kong, enormous density, extremely high standard of living for Asia. We have, those of you who have been to Hong Kong, I mean, it makes Manhattan look like Wyoming, let's face it. Any time of the day and night, you go out at 4 in the morning, there's thousands of people bumping into you. There's up the mountain slopes, there's apartment houses up to the peak of every mountain. Rows and rows of apartment houses. Fantastic. There's only about 40 private homes, I think, in all of Hong Kong, old British colonial types. And that's it. So it's, Japan is very high density and very high population, very high living standard. And also, some of the poorest areas in the world are low density. Africa, which is very low standard of living, is usually very low density. See, the problem in Africa is there's not much there are resources, but there's no capital investment. So even though there are very few people, they're starving. In other words, what you have is a low, and mostly in Africa, population density is very low, and standard of living is very low. In many parts of South America, also, South America has low density and low standard of living. The Brazilian interior, low standard of living, and people there are all starving and low density. So what you have over the world is a high income, a high increase of income, increase of capital investment will attract more people. People then move from where they're starving to the areas where there's more opportunity, like the United States in the 19th century or now. So the population flows to where if it can flow, if it's permitted by migration barriers, flows to where there's more opportunity and higher living standards. And Singapore is very high density and high standard of living. Families and by the people involved, because the kids, or if they weren't working in the factories, they were starving. I mean, literally. So it's considered better to have an 8-year-old working in a cotton spinning, etc., than for an 8-year-old to die out. It's considered better by the kid himself and by the family. It's only outside intellectuals who didn't know what was going on, sociologists, journalists, etc., who got the thing all screwed up. They never went to the rural areas. And this is one of the problems, by the way, with third world economists. I mean, American economists who go to third world countries, at least until quite recently, would never go to the rural areas. They just sit there in the capital city and get the government air-conditioned clubs and get the government handouts. The government officials never went to rural areas either. They didn't want to schlep up there in the jungles. So the misperception of what was going on is enormous. And at any rate, so this is pretty clear that there's no correlation between population density, and standard of living. And so that the focus on the population as being the key element, I think, misconceives the problem. In the West Indies, historically, when new entrepreneurial type groups come in, like Chinese and Lebanese, emigrate to the West Indies, the result with no capital, they just come in there and they start being entrepreneurs and saving and investing, etc. They wind up creating more jobs and more employment and better working conditions than without them. So you have an increased population and a higher standard of living as a result of the increased population. This often happens. And the Chinese, mostly in the rest of Asia, perform the same entrepreneurial role. Anyway, but I think you'll now find the new trends in China. I think they're getting away from this compulsory birth control.